Hello everybody. This is part of an ongoing project on cultivating agroecological resilience in Monteverde. And this year we are studying beekeeping and agrotourism in the Bellbird Biological Corridor.
So the Bellbird Biological Corridor is located on the Gulf of Nicoya going up to the Continental Divide. And it contains Monteverde up at the top, which is in the cloud forest and which a lot of people there work in tourism. And it also contains Guatemala in the middle here, which is a much warmer climate and a lot more people work in agriculture. And it was created in 2007, led by 7 different conservation organizations with the goal of conserving species ecosystems, improving the well-being of local communities, increasing economic activity, and improving the relationship between people and nature.
So just a little bit about beekeeping. There are a lot of different services that this provides, including environmental services. It provides pollination. This is a little mural here in Atenas, you might have seen it. It says, "Would we live without bees?" They provide a lot of the crops that we sustain ourselves on. And the art of beekeeping also incentivizes a lot of biodiversity in plants and decrease in pesticide use. And it also provides social services. It provides an opportunity for income for farmers and even non-landowners. And it provides an input of local healthy food and in local communities. And you might hear us talk about native bees versus European honeybees. Mariona are the most common form of native bees in Costa Rica. They're stingless, and they're much smaller. They provide often a smaller yield of honey, but they do have medicinal properties, and a lot of beekeepers use the European honeybees in order to create the honey that we consume in food every day.
Okay, so for our project we used a combination of mixed methodology, so that means we had both qualitative and quantitative methods. Our study period lasted from the 17th to the 22nd, so we had about a week. The main 3 methods we used were we did semi-structured interviews or discussions with as more so background information, primary knowledge receivers, and so that was with Luis Angel, who's a beekeeper from San Luis, which is a little more down the mountain than Monteverde, so a lower elevation. Luis Ramirez, who's the vice president of the Guatemala Beekeepers Association, he's from Guatemala. Gabriel Cruz, who is the owner of a regenerative dairy farm in Monteverde, which is called Finca Amanecer. And then Anibal Torres, who is the Community Initiative Center Director at the Monteverde Institute. And then we also had beekeeper surveys, which was a 31-question survey focusing on the beekeeper relationships with the environment, with their community, with their cultural traditions, all of that. And then out of the 15 members of the Guatemala Beekeepers Association, there was 8 surveys completed. And then finally we had tourist surveys, which was an 11-question survey. We ended up administering 55 of these surveys. And so that was taken over the course of 5 surveying sessions and 3 major locations in Monteverde, so the downtown and 2 more shopping centers. And so our presentation is going to follow sort of our individual papers. It's going to start with Lily's, which is mapping relationships between beekeepers, and then it's going to go into a little more specifics about food justice within this space of beekeeping, and that's Sarah's presentation, and then my presentation, which is about agrotourism and sacrifice areas in agricultural spaces.
So my paper is a relationship map of beekeeper communities in the Bellbird Biological Corridor. And my research question is, how do beekeepers in the corridor relate to and work with their community, each other farmers, and conservation groups? And to answer this, I looked at some other papers just to get some background, and there was clearly a lack of knowledge here. We talked to Anibal Torres, and he said that, as coordinators of the corridor, they don't know a lot about the beekeepers there, so this is definitely a knowledge gap that needed to be filled. And then I also looked at some background information on beekeepers in other parts of the world. I looked at beekeepers and conservation with a case study in Florida that looked at beekeepers wanting to put beehives on conservation land, which would be beneficial to both the beekeepers and the plants that they are pollinating. But there is a lot of red tape around it. It's very hard for them to use that land well. And then I also looked at beekeepers and other farmers. This case study was from Europe, and it looked at how a lot of farmers felt that their crops were not being pollinated well enough, and beekeepers could help with that, but a lot of them didn't know about the beekeepers and didn't utilize them. And then there was also an issue of pesticide use, which harms the bees. And for my methods, I focused on the producer surveys and on information gained from tours and interviews. I did not use the tourism surveys. And so here are some of the survey questions that I focused on. I'm not going to read them all, but we looked at what challenges do producers face, and if they have forested areas, if they've done anything sustainable on their properties, if they participated in the corridor at all, and if they gain, like what they gain from being part of the cooperative, is their collaboration among local farmers, and also have they participated in festivals or events with the broader community. So my results can be divided into sort of 4 different categories. There's the collective benefit from being in the association, the biological corridor and the sustainability practices, the farmer cooperation, but also the issue of pesticides, and then the wider community, and also in that category, there's sales in the market as well. So for the Beekeepers Association, these are some of the things that people said. They said that they gained benefits from selling honey, and being able to sell honey and gain access to the market through the association. It also helped them buy supplies. It localized production, because one of the things that they own is a machine for making frames that the bees will build their honeycomb on, which as an association they were able to purchase that together, but if they didn't have that, they would have to buy their frames from somewhere else. Also being part of the association gives them access to government aid, and it helps them share skills. They can gain experiences, but they will also use the association to share experiences and teach new people about beekeeping. And then for the biological corridor, we found that overall there was not a lot of relation between them. We had exactly one person who said that they had reforested because of the corridor. But despite not having a strong relationship with the corridor, a lot of them have done other things for sustainability. A lot of them have forested areas on their land, which they said was to help with nectar production or to help conserve water sources. Although there was also an issue of land ownership. We talked to one beekeeper who wanted to have his whole land forested, but he lived there with his family, and his family didn't want that, so he wasn't able to do that. And then people also did say that while they didn't have a direct relationship with the corridor, they did benefit from being in the corridor. It helped with their honey production, and it also helped them with the market. As far as local farmers, about 2/3 of them said that they had relationships with other farmers, which included just helping each other out. It also included putting beehives on their land to gain access to more nectar for the bees. But there is also a problem with pesticides, local farmers using pesticides, which harms the bees. And one solution that has been proposed is that farmers don't spray their plants when they're in bloom. I'm not sure how much that has actually been put into practice, but it was a suggestion for the future. And then finally, there's the community at large. 4 different farmers said that they participated in local events, like parades or festivals, as beekeepers. And they also all said that they would love to share beekeeping skills with anyone who is not currently a beekeeper but would like to learn. And some of them said that they had already hosted workshops and done those things. And then there's also the market here. A lot of them sell to a big honey corporation, a national corporation that sells honey. But some of them did sell in local stores or to individuals. And so maybe that's one way that they interact with their community as well, but there's also a perception of honey that goes into that. Some people we talk to also believe that honey has been adulterated, which is partially true. I think Sarah's going to talk more about that later, but that also definitely affects their relationship with the community. And so this is kind of the final thing that I created, which is a map of beekeepers and their relationships with other people. So we have the solid arrows here showing where they have a relationship right now, and then the dashed arrows showing where their relationship could be improved. So the dashed arrow here to local farmers is primarily about pesticide use, and then the one to the Bellbird Biological Corridor is about just the lack of communication overall and involvement. So here are my conclusions. There was a strong relationship between beekeepers and each other and their communities and other farms. However, there are problems with pesticide use that could be addressed in the future, and there's also very little connection to the corridor. So both the beekeepers should try and reach out to the corridor, but also the managers of the corridor should reach out to the beekeepers to work with them. And here are my sources. Thank you, guys.
Hello everybody. As mentioned, I'm looking at beekeeping in the Bellbird Biological Corridor from a food justice perspective. So my main guiding question is, does beekeeping in the BBC follow the principles of food justice? So for some background information about food production, this is going to be mostly about dairy, but it relates, I promise. So before the Quakers settled in the 1950s, there were a lot of Costa Rican networks between dairy farmers with practices of self-sufficiency. And then when the Quakers came in the 50s, this only increased that self-reliance attitude in dairy farming, and they even made the Monteverde Dairy Cooperative. However, this changed around the 1980s when there was a big tourism boom, and there was a big land use shift from a lot of agriculture to tourism and conservation. And although conservation land is great, that does mean a decrease in local food production, and it sort of weakens that industry a little bit. And because of this, some big companies or big dairy were able to sort of take advantage of local farmers, buy their product for less and less, and eventually Sigma bought out Monteverde Dairy Cooperative. And this sort of like presents this sort of cautionary tale to different industries of food production. Potentially this could happen with bee companies or small bee producers. After some research, I found 6 key ideas about food justice that I will be evaluating the beekeepers in the BBC on. And these questions are sort of how I contextualize these different categories into beekeeping. So for fair wages, is it economically viable? Are beekeepers able to sustain an income from beekeeping? Affordability, are local community members reasonably able to afford their product? Nutrition, is it adulterated or is it pure honey? Sustainability, do they practice sustainable practices? Or do they use pesticides or too many chemicals with their bees, etc.? Cultural preservation, is it a familiar or regional tradition? And then finally, addressing systematic inequality, I decided the best way to approach this is to evaluate whether the beekeeping in this area was mainly supporting local food networks, or was it mainly just feeding into large honey distributors or big honey. So I talked a little about the methods, but the methods that I specifically used. I used our discussions with Gabriel Rojas from the Monteverde Institute and Gabriel Rojas from the Regenerative Dairy Farm for background information about the area. But for my evaluations on the beekeepers, I used a whole lot of information from the surveys and interviews, so I won't list all the questions, but that's how I evaluated them. So my main findings were that there was a little bit of a division between beekeepers. The association in Guasimal, Asoguasi, tended to be more yield focused, but the beekeeper we talked to in San Luis had a much more heavy focus on bee conservation. But this is not to say they're mutually exclusive. They have a lot of similarities, such as that they both have native and European honeybees. They both do have pure natural honey for sale. They're both small family-run operations, and they both use sustainable practices, which I'll talk about. But there are some notable differences. The yield-focused beekeepers use some sugar water, whereas the conservation beekeeper he was very adamant that he did not use sugar water and was very not happy with beekeepers that do use it. Yield-focused beekeepers do sell to Big Honey, a large amount of their honey actually, and the conservation-focused beekeeper was fully independent. And the yield-focused beekeepers, as I mentioned, their focus in their field is to maximize their profit to make a livelihood for them and their family. But the conservation beekeeper, his goal was more to preserve the native bee species of Costa Rica and help foster relationships between humans, food, and the earth. And finally, the yield-focused beekeepers are in their local association, whereas the conservation beekeeper was only in a national organization and didn't really have many local ties. So here are the results for my evaluations on each of the categories. As you can see, the X means they really did not uphold this pillar very well. If the squiggly line means it's unclear or the results vary, 1 check mark means it did uphold the pillar, and then 2 means it upholds the pillar very well. So first for affordability, they're both like pretty affordable. Like you can get a pretty large container of honey for cheaper than you would at a grocery store typically, which I thought was pretty cool. But the yield-focused beekeepers were able to sell their honey for less. And this is due to a variety of reasons, including that they have a bigger harvest. And because of that, they use sugar water instead of honey to sustain the bees during the low season. And then they also use more machine processing versus the conservation beekeeper did more hand processing of the honey. And this sort of ties into the fair wages aspect. The yield-focused beekeepers were able to make more of a profit because of the reasons I just listed. And the conservation beekeeper, he was semi-retired, so it was more of like, it seems to be a little bit more of like a passion project than like a practice that could sustain a household. So it's a little bit unclear about the economic viability of that. And next, they both use pretty sustainable practices, as Lily talked about. A lot of them reforested areas, but I thought the conservation beekeeper really excelled in this topic. He had a really, really great biodiverse property, and he had a lot more native bees than the yield-focused beekeepers did. And he also did not use medicine on his bees, which he said was better for the bee health. Next, they both upheld cultural preservation, although beekeepers cited that it was a tradition in their family to keep bees. And next, the nutrition for the yield-focused beekeepers varies a lot because they sell their honey in multiple ways. They can sell it to you like as a person, and that's honey. That honey is going to be very pure and nutritious. However, they do sell a lot of their honey to large honey distributors, as I mentioned. And after these honey distributors buy the honey from the Guatemala beekeepers, we talked to some different people, as much as half of the honey is going to be cornstarch after they sort of adulterate it. And that obviously is not good for us, and it dilutes the nutrients in the honey. But the conservation-focused beekeeper, his honey is very pure, and he even sells medicinal honey from the native bees. And finally, because they sell to large honey distributors, I said the yield-focused beekeepers did not address systematic inequality because they're sort of supporting these large exploitative companies. It was Mondiza, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that, the tea company. Monzate, yes, thank you. That's who they sell to. And it sort of leaves them in danger of falling into the same pattern as we've seen in dairy production in Monteverde. But the conservation-focused beekeeper, he was totally independent. And this is a visual I made in my paper, sort of outlining this, but I won't go over this all again. And I have some recommendations for them. The conservation-focused beekeeper, Lily sort of talked about this, but the Guatemala Association, they have a lot of benefits from being in an association. They get government aid, they knowledge share, and this is sort of an opportunity that the San Luis beekeeper who's focused on conservation is missing out on because he doesn't think their practices are sustainable enough, so he doesn't like associating with them, but that's kind of a missed opportunity for him to like potentially share his knowledge and even help them out. And the yield-focused beekeepers, they could, as Lily talked about, have more connections to different organizations such as the Bellbird Biological Corridor. and this would help them decrease the amount that they sell to large honey distributors. And finally, for both of them, I recommend introducing agrotourism to have a diversified income, because for the conservational beekeeper, this could help him increase his income, and it would help the yield-focused beekeepers sort of tap into this different market of farmer to customer. So again, you can have more local sales and less big honey sales. And some areas for future research on this would be to talk to more conservation-focused beekeepers, because as I said, we only talked to one, so it would be great to have more perspectives on that. And then finally, if we could talk to coordinators of the Bellbird Biological Corridor and sort of learn more about their projects, and if they would be interested in collaborating with the beekeepers, that would be interesting to look at. Here are my references. Thank you.
All right, hello all. My presentation is called Agrotourism and Sacrifice Areas, a case study of Costa Rica's Bellbird Biological Corridor. To give some background context, the main issue I'm addressing in my paper is the problem of overvisitation, which is a problem that's been increasing pretty rapidly over the past, since the turn of the 21st century, basically. And this is especially relevant when talking about tourism into natural areas. So that would be like national parks and etc., because that can cause pretty severe environmental harm for a variety of reasons and harm to local communities. And so the framework I'm looking at is the use of sacrifice areas to manage this issue. Sacrifice areas are a land management strategy focused on assessing a system's, an environmental system's naturalness, and then seeing whether or not it has the potential to, if it's altered, and if it is altered, if it has the potential to eco-redevelop or regenerate back into a more natural form. If it doesn't, then it's designated as a sacrifice area where a lot of tourism is directed, so that the harms of tourism are more concentrated into an area that doesn't have the potential to become natural once again. And so an example of that would be like Cadillac Mountain in Acadia National Park, or the Hoh Rainforest in Olympic National Park in the United States, or Monteverde. And so some key ideas I'm going to tackle in this paper with this topic is agrotourism, which is tourism based in agriculture and using rural communities as a tourist location. And then ecotourism, which is using these natural spaces as a tourist destination. And so the definition of ecotourism focuses on tourism that's based in conservation and appreciating natural environments, but that's strayed from the truth in the real world. Now it's more so just visiting natural environments no matter the harms. And then eco-redevelopment, which is restoration of a space. It doesn't have to be back to its natural state, but to a state that can sustain both the needs of humans and the environment. And then naturalness, which is a way of assessing how natural an environment is. That's what you use in sacrifice areas. It's based in 3 pillars, which would be how much the system would change if humans were removed, the percent / complement of native species in an environment before human settlement versus after, and then there's another one that I can't remember right now. But yeah, it's basically surrounding the idea of how a system would change if humans weren't there. The amount of cultural energy required to maintain a system. So the goal of my research is to assess if sacrifice areas are the only option of land management in Monteverde surrounding agrotourism and ecotourism. And so I'll analyze this question through data surrounding what tourists want, successful practices about agro-ecotourism in the area, and then what benefits farmers looking to get involved in agrotourism believe that they could provide, and also that would be provided to them if they were to get involved. And so my goal is, again, to find a less harmful alternative to managing this issue. So that would be just an alternative with less negative impacts than sacrifice areas because it does work, it just has negative impacts. And so this would preserve cultures and environments while allowing for that. So as mentioned before, I use a mixed methodology. I focus pretty heavily on tourist surveys, which used a variety of question types, and then also personal interviews. Particularly relevant to me was an interview with Gretel Cruz, who owned the regenerative dairy farm Bellbird, and then producer surveys from the members of Asogasi, the Beekeepers Association. So for my results, first I'll start with the tourist surveys. As you can see here, I have a table of tourist interests in a variety of activities. You can see that wildlife viewing and hiking, which I'm considering in this the ecotourism activities, have a significantly higher level of interest from tourists as compared to other activities, and that's proven by a t-test. And then activities like food tours are less, but there's still a sizable amount of interest in them. And then 55.36% of the tourist surveys had taken a food tour on any vacation, but we found that a majority of those food tours that were taken were coffee or chocolate tours in Monteverde or Costa Rica. 51.79% of tourists were aware of honey production in the region, which is fairly high given that it's not a staple like coffee or chocolate. And then 58.93% of tourists were interested in taking a food tour on vacation. And to get into a little more specifics of that, I found that, like suspected, because they're staples of Costa Rica, coffee and chocolate they garnered a significantly larger amount of interest than other farm tours, were the third most interested topic. And that's likely because Monteverde is a place that garners so much ecotourism and tourism based in the environment, which means there's a tourist base that's heavily focused on conservation. And then honey and beekeeping was the lowest interest, but there was still a sizable amount of interest for the lack of knowledge surrounding it. So basically, before I go into this, I'll just say that what's important from those surveys is that while agrotourism is not of highest interest for tourists, it is interested, but that ecotourism is the highest interest, and so that it's important to look at how we can combine eco and agrotourism to get more interest in this space for tourists. And so an example of this working is Lily, the regenerative dairy farm, run by Gretel Cruz, and it has extremely successfully integrated agrotourism and ecotourism. And this has benefited them in a lot of ways, primarily with economic diversification. So as Sarah mentioned, there has been a recent crisis surrounding Sigma, which bought out the Monteverde Dairy Cooperative and is causing a lot of economic problems for local producers. But because they have switched so heavily towards tourism, they've been able to be less reliant on Sigma, and they can make a lot more money. For example, they sell their milk to direct tourist customers for $4, which is a lot more than they could if they were selling to Sigma. And then they also have established cabins. They've established night walks, so like nature walks looking for wildlife at night. And then they sell directly to tourists. And they also have a strong tourist education program indirectly, which is they'll provide fresh eggs and bananas and things like that to their customers who are staying in the cabins, and then they'll encourage them to give the waste to their pigs, highlighting the circular system. And basically all of this is a result of tourism and the fact that the tourism is encouraging sustainable development on the farm through like the fact that you couldn't have night walks in an extremely harmed ecosystem. So that's sort of encouraging them this economic opportunity to redevelop further. And so that's an extremely successful example. And then an area where we think there could be a lot of future success is with the Guatemala beekeepers. Beekeeping is intrinsically involved with the environment because bees rely so heavily on plants and nature. And so there's already a lot of agroecological principles being used in beekeeping. but this will only be intensified by tourism. And here you can see a table of some of the main takeaways from the surveys of what they think the benefits would be of introducing agritourism into their farm. So you can see there's an increase of conservation and sustainability efforts. As Sarah mentioned, some of our farmers that we talked to wanted to develop more, and I think that introducing agritourism would be the final push. There's economic diversification, as seen on Berto's farm, and then there's also enabling a lot of social things, including enabling word-of-mouth outreach, which would spread the knowledge of the different communities away from Monteverde, basically creating reverse sacrifice areas on these farms and taking tourism away from Monteverde Central, which is the sacrifice area in this situation. So some main conclusions of this are that using agritourism institutions as reverse sacrifice areas does work, and it is something that should be expanded because the idea is that if you put tourism into agricultural spaces so that they become a sacrifice area, it actually does the opposite because it encourages eco-redevelopment for them. So that would actually eliminate the harms and introduce benefits. And then apiculture farms are a great place to begin this expansion because of the reasons mentioned before. Future research should surround more detailed analysis of the relationship between agrotourism and the environment, and specifically in this case, the Bellbird Biological Corridor, because we unfortunately did not get to speak with the director of the Bellbird Biological Corridor, so I'm not aware of many of like the discrete how it's affected, how they're related, but that's one of our limitations. And other limitations were tourist demographics and time for research. So yeah.